Ruth Ellis was a British escort and nightclub hostess. She was the last woman to be hanged in the United Kingdom after being convicted of the murder of her lover, David Blakely. During her childhood, Ellis' family moved from Rhyl to Basingstoke, Hampshire, and, in 1941, to Hampstead in London. In her teens she entered the world of London nightclub hostessing, which led to a chaotic life that included various relationships with men. One of these was with David Blakely, a racing driver engaged to another woman. On Easter Sunday, the 10th of April 1955, Ellis shot Blakely dead outside the Magdala public house in Hampstead, and she was immediately arrested by an off-duty policeman. At her trial in June 1955, she was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death. On the 13th of July, she was hanged at HMP Holloway. Ruth Ellis was born in Rhyl in North Wales, the fifth of 6 children. During her childhood her family moved to Basingstoke, Hampshire. Her mother, Elisabetta Goethals, was a Belgian war refugee. Her father, Arthur Hornby, was a cellist from Manchester. The Register of Marriages gives Arthur Hornby as marrying Elisa B. Goethals, at Chilton-cum-Hardy, in 1920. Arthur changed his surname to Nielsen after the birth of Ruth's older sister Muriel in 1925. Ruth attended Fairfield Senior Girls' School in Basingstoke, leaving when she was 14 to work as a waitress. Shortly afterwards, in 1941, the Nielsens moved to London. In 1944, 17-year-old Ruth became pregnant by a married Canadian soldier named Claire and gave birth to a son, whom she named Claire Andrea Nielsen, known as Andy. The father sent money for about a year, then stopped. The child eventually went to live with Ruth's mother. Ruth became a nightclub hostess in Hampstead through nude modeling work, which paid significantly more than the various factory and clerical jobs she had held since leaving school. Maurice Conley, her manager at the Court Club in Duke Street, blackmailed his hostess employees into sleeping with him. By early 1950, Ruth was making money as a full-service escort and became pregnant by one of her regular clients. She had this pregnancy terminated illegally in the 3rd month and returned to work as soon as she could. On the 8th of November 1950, Ruth married 41-year-old George Johnston Ellis, a divorced dentist with 2 sons, at the Register Office in Tunbridge, Kent. He had been a customer at the Court Club. George was a violent alcoholic, jealous and possessive, and the marriage deteriorated rapidly because he was convinced his new wife was having an affair. Ruth left him several times but always returned. In 1951, while 4 months pregnant, Ruth appeared, uncredited, as a beauty queen in the Rank film Lady Godiva Rides Again. She subsequently gave birth to a daughter, Georgina, but George refused to acknowledge paternity and they separated shortly afterwards and were later divorced. Ruth and her son moved in with her parents and she went back to sex work to make ends meet. In 1953, Ruth Ellis became the manager of the Little Club, a nightclub in Knightsbridge. At this time, she was lavished with expensive gifts by admirers and had a number of celebrity friends. Ellis met David Blakely, 3 years her junior, through racing driver Mike Hawthorne. Blakely was a former public school boy who was educated at Shrewsbury School and Sandhurst, but also a hard-drinking racer. Within weeks he moved into Ellis's flat above the club despite being engaged to another woman, Mary Dawson. Ellis became pregnant for the 4th time but had her 2nd abortion, feeling she could not reciprocate the level of commitment shown by Blakely towards their relationship. Ellis then began seeing Desmond Cusson, a former Royal Air Force pilot who had flown Lancaster bombers during the Second World War, and had taken up accountancy after leaving the service. He was appointed a director of the family business Cusson and Company, a wholesale and retail tobacconist with outlets in London and South Wales. Ellis eventually moved in with Cusson at 20 Goodwood Court, Devonshire Street, north of Oxford Street. The relationship with Blakely continued, however, and became increasingly violent as he and Ellis continued to see other people. Blakely offered to marry Ellis, to which she consented, but in January 1955 she had another miscarriage after he punched her in the stomach during an argument. On Easter Sunday, the 10th of April 1955, Ellis took a taxi from Cusson's home to a second-floor flat at 29 Tanzer Road, Hampstead, the home of Anthony and Carol Findlater, where she suspected Blakely might be. As she arrived, Blakely's car drove off, so she paid off the taxi and walked the 1/4 mile to the Magdala, a relatively large public house in South Hill Park where she found Blakely's car parked outside. At around 9:30 p.m. Blakely and his friend Clive Gunnell emerged. Blakely passed Ellis waiting on the pavement when she stepped out of Henshaw's doorway, a newsagent next to the Magdala. As Blakely searched for the keys to his car, Ellis took a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Victory model revolver from her handbag and fired 5 shots at Blakely. The first shot missed and he started to run, pursued by Ellis round the car, where she fired a second, which caused him to collapse onto the pavement. Ellis then stood over him and fired 3 more bullets into him. One bullet was fired less than half an inch from Blakely's back and left powder burns on his skin. Ellis was seen to stand over Blakely as she repeatedly tried to fire the revolver's 6th shot, finally firing it into the ground. This bullet ricocheted off the road and injured a bystander, who lost the use of her left thumb. Ellis, in apparent shock, asked Gunnell, "Will you call the police, Clive?" She was arrested immediately by an off-duty policeman, who heard her say, "I am guilty, I'm a little confused." Blakely's body was taken to hospital with multiple fatal wounds to the intestines, liver, lung, aorta and trachea. Originally taken in as evidence, the revolver is now in the Metropolitan Police's Crime Museum. At Hampstead Police Station, Ellis appeared to be calm and not obviously under the influence of drink or drugs. She made a detailed confession and was charged with murder. She made her first appearance at a magistrate's court on the 11th of April 1955 and was ordered to be held on remand. Ellis was twice examined by Principal Medical Officer, M.R. Penry Williams, who failed to find evidence of mental illness. An electroencephalograph examination on the 3rd of May found no abnormality. While on remand, she was examined by psychiatrist Dr. D. Whitaker for the defense, and by Dr. A. Dalzell on behalf of the Home Office. Neither found evidence of insanity. On the 20th of June 1955, Ellis appeared in the No. 1 Court at the Old Bailey, London, before Mr. Justice Havers. She was dressed in a black suit and white silk blouse with freshly bleached and coiffured blonde hair. Ellis's defending counsel, Aubrey Melford Stevenson, supported by Sebag Shaw and Peter Rawlinson, expressed concern about her appearance, but she did not alter it to appear less striking. The only question put to Ellis by prosecutor Christmas Humphreys was, "When you fired the revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do?" Her answer was, "It's obvious when I shot him I intended to kill him." This reply guaranteed a guilty verdict and the mandatory death sentence. The jury took 20 minutes to convict her. Ellis remained at Holloway Prison while awaiting execution. She told her mother that she did not want a petition to reprieve her from the death sentence, and took no part in the campaign. However, at her relatives urging her solicitor, John Bickford, wrote a 7-page letter to Home Secretary Gwilym Lloyd George setting out the grounds for reprieve. Lloyd George denied the request. In a 2010 television interview, the grandson of Mr. Justice Havers, actor Nigel Havers, said his grandfather had written to Lloyd George recommending a reprieve as he regarded it as a crime passionnel, but received a curt refusal. Ellis dismissed Bickford, who had been chosen by Cusson, and asked to see Leon Simmons, the clerk to solicitor Victor Mishcon, whose law firm had previously represented her in her divorce proceedings. Before going to see her, Simmons and Mishcon visited Bickford, who urged them to ask Ellis where she had obtained the gun. On the 12th of July 1955, the day before her execution, Mishcon and Simmons saw Ellis, who wanted to make her will. When they pressed Ellis for the full story, she asked them to promise not to use what she said to try to secure a reprieve. Mishcon refused. Ellis then said that she had been drinking with Cusson for most of the weekend and that he had given her the gun and some shooting practice. Cusson had also driven her to the murder scene. Following a 2-hour interview, Mishcon and Simmons went to the Home Office. The permanent secretary, Sir Frank Newsam, was summoned back to London and ordered the head of SID to check the story. Lloyd George later said that the police were able to make considerable inquiries but that it made no difference to his decision, and in fact made Ellis's guilt greater by showing the murder was premeditated. Lloyd George also said that the injury to the bystander was decisive in his decision: "We cannot have people shooting off firearms in the street." In a final letter to Blakely's parents from her prison cell, Ellis wrote, "I have always loved your son, and I shall die still loving him." The Bishop of Stepney, Juice de Blanc, visited Ellis prior to her execution. Just before 9 a.m. on the 13th of July, the hangman, Albert Pierpoint, and his assistant entered Ellis's cell and took her to the adjacent execution room where she was hanged. As was customary in British executions, she was buried in an unmarked grave within the walls of Holloway Prison. In the early 1970s, the remains of executed women were exhumed for reburial elsewhere. In Ellis's case, she was reburied in the churchyard of St. Mary's Church in Amersham, Buckinghamshire. Her headstone was inscribed Ruth Hornby 1926–1955. Her son, Andy, destroyed the headstone shortly before he committed suicide in 1982. Ellis's husband, George Ellis, descended into alcoholism and died by suicide, hanging himself at a Jersey hotel on the 2nd of August 1958. In 1969, Ellis's mother, Berta Nielsen, was found unconscious in a gas-filled room in her flat in Hemel Hempstead. She never fully recovered and did not speak coherently again. Ellis's son, Andy, who was aged 10 at the time of his mother's hanging, took his life in a bedsit in 1982, shortly after desecrating his mother's grave. The trial judge, Sir Cecil Havers, had sent money every year for Andy's upkeep, and Christmas Humphreys, the prosecution counsel at Ellis's trial, paid for his funeral. Ellis's daughter, Georgina, who was 3 when her mother was executed, was fostered when her father killed himself 3 years later. She died of cancer aged 50.